Radioactive Boy Scout. Hello friends! In this edition, we explore the incredible story of how an ordinary teenager built a nuclear reactor in a shed in his backyard. This boy's name was David Hahn, though he became widely known as the Radioactive Boy Scout. At just 70 years old, David managed to create a working nuclear reactor using materials he had on hand right in the backyard of his mother's house. As astonishing and shocking as it may sound that a boy constructed a nuclear reactor in a simple shed, the tale of how this became possible and the ensuing chaos makes the story even more astonishing. David was born in 1966 in Clinton, a suburb of Detroit, USA. His parents divorced when he was young, and David lived with his father and stepmother, visiting his biological mother on weekends. At the age of 10, his grandfather gave him the Golden Book of Chemical Experiments, a seemingly harmless gift that drastically altered David's life and set off a series of crazy events. The book had a huge impact on him, sparking an intense fascination with chemistry. He even set up a small laboratory in his room at his father's house, not just with plastic flasks and food-colored water, as one might expect from an ordinary child, but with real glassware, burners, and shelves filled with encyclopedias and chemistry textbooks. By the age of 40, when most kids were conducting harmless experiments and making baking soda volcanoes, David was already producing dangerous nitroglycerin. Once, he arrived at the Boy Scout camp with his skin stained orange from an experiment with homemade tanning lotion that had caused him to get poisoned with the chemical. He even conducted experiments on himself. Later, in the same camp, while trying to make fireworks with magnesium he had brought along, David burned a large hole in the tent roof. Despite the constant smoke and small explosions in the boys' room, David's father and stepmother did not forbid these experiments. Burned wallpaper, damaged furniture, and chemicals spilled on the carpet, it seemed like this should have put an end to his hobby. But no. The parents merely moved his laboratory to the basement because they were tired of his experiments constantly ruining the furniture and items in the children's room. However, for David, the move to the basement was not a punishment at all, quite the opposite. Now he had more space and privacy for his increasingly dangerous experiments. The boy became more and more obsessed with chemistry, and his experiments started to take on increasingly dangerous characteristics. Eventually, however, an incident occurred that necessitated closing down the basement laboratory, or rather moving it to another location. One day, an explosion occurred in the basement. His parents, rushing downstairs, found David nearly unconscious. It turned out that the boy had been scrapping red phosphorus, which is used in matchstick production, with a screwdriver, and it exploded. David neglected safety precautions, wearing no goggles or protective gear, and shards of glass got into his face and eyes, requiring a visit to the ophthalmologist. It seemed that this time, any normal parent would take away the chemical set and materials from the child. But in David's case, his laboratory was simply relocated to another place, a shed in the backyard of his mother's house. From this point on, things began to take on a radioactive nature. David spent days and nights in the shed, doing who knows what, but neither his mother nor her boyfriend paid any attention to it. They merely admired his persistence and diligence. One day, his mother's boyfriend did ask what he was doing, to which David vaguely replied, "You see, one day we will run out of oil." David's father tried to channel the boy's energy into something useful and suggested that David earn the rank of Eagle Scout, the highest rank in the Boy Scout hierarchy. To achieve this rank, Scouts must earn 21 merit badges in various disciplines, some mandatory and others optional. For example, one can earn a badge from woodworking skills or conservation efforts. But David went further and chose nuclear energy. His choice alarmed absolutely no one, despite being the only scout in the history of the movement to choose this discipline. As part of his science project, David created an informational pamphlet explaining that nuclear energy is good, useful, and needs more study. He also drew a diagram explaining the process of nuclear fission and created a harmless toy model of a nuclear reactor using juice cans, straws, hangers, matches, and rubber bands. As part of the project, he also visited a local hospital where they explained the principles of X-rays and radioactive isotopes to him. One May 10, 1991, a few months before his 15th birthday, David finally earned his merit badge for achievements in nuclear energy. After this, apparently not satisfied with the toy reactor, David decided to build a real nuclear reactor in the shed in the backyard. And guess what? He did it! But to do so, David had to overcome several challenges and obstacles. Incidentally, no one had ever before succeeded in building a nuclear reactor at home. Perhaps no one had ever thought of such an incredible idea. For the reactor to work, fuel is needed, and usually uranium or plutonium is used for this. In other words, for the reactor to work, David, a 15-year-old teenager, had to obtain genuinely dangerous radioactive substances, which should theoretically be impossible, right? But no. Pretending to be a physics teacher, he started communicating with workers in the nuclear industry, specifically the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the American Nuclear Society, the Edison Electric Institute, and other organizations. The boy made phone calls, wrote letters, and asked about the reactor's operation and the components needed for its construction. The recipients responded in detail, without once verifying his identity. Most interestingly, he received the most help from Donald Earp, the director of an isotope production and distribution agency at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It was Earp who, when asked about the risk of the work being done, replied that the danger was not too great. Under normal circumstances, it would be impossible to legally obtain radioactive materials in quantities posing a threat to the public. But this wasn't a normal situation. This was David, for goodness sake. Hahn, Eagle Scout. As David would later say in an interview, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission gave me all the necessary information. All that remained was for me to obtain the necessary materials. From old Scout booklets, David learned that radioactive substances in small quantities could be found in smoke detectors, luminous paint on clock hands, and gas lamp mantles. But he needed a lot of these things, much more than ordinary people would buy. To obtain them, he continued pretending to be a school teacher. First, he called a company that produced smoke detectors and said he needed 100 detectors, quote, for a school project. Not only did they agree to sell him 100 detectors at a discount, but they also explained exactly where in the detector the radioactive element, americium, could be found, without even trying to verify his identity and intentions. After obtaining the needed americium, he made a so-called neutron gun, the first step in the nuclear fission process, and still, no adult stepped in to stop him. No one cared about what David was doing in his shed all this time. Meanwhile, David obtained radium from old clocks purchased at an antique shop. He sourced thorium from gas lamp mantles. His acquaintance from a hospital laboratory provided him with beryllium. And he, why not, simply ordered uranium over the phone from Czechoslovakia. When the radioactive elements and necessary knowledge were acquired, David was already 17 years old. Then he embarked on creating the most significant experiment of his life. David mixed radium and americium, placing the mixture in aluminium foil. From this, he made the core of the nuclear reactor. He surrounded this core with cubes made of thorium ash and uranium powder, which were also wrapped in foil and held together. How else? With duct tape. As a result, David had a functioning and highly dangerous nuclear reactor operating in the backyard of his mother's house. Changing shoes and clothes when entering the shed was the extent of David's safety measures. He began to worry when his Geiger counter started detecting radiation levels not only in the shed itself, but also in the neighboring block. Even David now realized that not only he, but also the people around him were in danger. So the reactor needed to be dismantled and the parts buried in different places. And David decided to do it like professionals do. He planned to transport the reactor parts at night in the trunk of a car. Late at night on August 31, 1994, he began loading the reactor into the trunk when the police suddenly appeared, called by his neighbors who thought he was stealing tires. The police wanted to search the car, but David advised them to be very careful because, quote, "There is high radiation. These are not words the police like to hear." Thinking he might have an atomic bomb, they called it the bomb squad. The summon squad, of course, did not find a bomb, but they detected radiation levels 1,000 times above normal, which automatically triggered an emergency response plan for a radioactive threat. It seemed that finally, adults had intervened. Well, almost. It took 2 months. 2 months after David's arrest before any action was taken. David said nothing to the police about the shed, and the police didn't think to check it. They only learned about it 2 months later. Even then, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission didn't handle the site cleanup because the residential property wasn't under federal jurisdiction. Only in January, 5 months after David's arrest, did representatives from the Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) arrive, concluding that the site posed a direct and significant threat to public health and the environment. They noted that potential and actual radiation exposure in the area affected the human population, animals, as well as food and water. The conclusion also stated that heavy rain, wind, or fire could expand the contamination zone. What they didn't know then but learned later was that during those 5 months of inaction, David's mother had thrown out a large amount of material from the shed in the regular trash. Yes, you heard that right. David's mother unknowingly disposed of highly radioactive materials, the cleanup and transport of which required a highly professional approach, in an ordinary garbage can, thereby exposing an even larger area and number of people to radioactive contamination. The EPA conducted a full cleanup and decontamination of the site only in June. Specialists completely dismantled the shed, sealed all the materials, and buried them at the radioactive waste disposal site. And of course, they billed David's parents $60,000 for their work. According to the official assessment of the agency, at least 40,000 people were exposed to high levels of radiation from David's experiments with the nuclear reactor. The agency also offered David a full medical examination to assess the extent of his radiation exposure. However, David refused, possibly fearing what he might find out. His life and relationships with his family deteriorated significantly after this incident. After the entire country learned about the failed experiment, David was labeled a mad scientist. He fell into depression, stopped pursuing science, and soon joined the Marine Corps. At the age of 31, David returned from the military. One would think that everything was behind him, and it was time to live a new life. But that wasn't the case with David. Due to the danger of the experiment he conducted as a teenager, the FBI continued to monitor him, and, as it turned out, not without reason. Soon, David was arrested for stealing smoke detectors which contained one of the necessary elements. It became clear that he hadn't calmed down and still wanted to complete the experiment. He was sentenced to 3 months in jail for theft. Later, he was examined by psychiatrists because his idea with the reactor had become an obsession. When David was released from jail, he no longer conducted experiments, which was practically impossible anyway, as he was constantly monitored by the FBI. In the face of depression, he began using illegal substances and alcohol. In 2016, the man died at the age of 39, presumably due to alcohol poisoning. Surprisingly, no one from the scientific community supported the curious young man who simply loved science. The renowned experimental scientist in the field of nuclear physics, Albert Ghiarso, analyzed Hahn's experiments and wrote in his article that, unfortunately for Hahn, there was no one he could turn to who could refute his ideas. Of course, his experiments were dangerous, but such enthusiasm could have been directed toward positive contributions. It is quite possible that the world lost a brilliant scientist in David, who could have made remarkable discoveries that would change the world.